Parasites within our nation want wealth, power, and influence. Non-parasites, that is, the majority of us who are honest people, may also want these things to a greater or lesser degree, although not exclusively, as we recognize that many other things are important in life. But we do not use the methods of the parasites to attain them. We may make wealth for our nation in one way or another. The entrepreneur, the accountant, the road sweeper all contribute to the wealth of the nation. The parasite does not create wealth. The parasite extracts wealth created by others. In nature, the parasite does the same thing, although here we are not talking about wealth, of course, but about the richness or goodness produced by non-parasites. The fluke that lives in the intestines of an animal contributes nothing to the host, but simply extracts the goodness the host manufactures. Sometimes the parasites in nature may kill the host, but this is not the intention of most of them, for they need the host to survive. To cope with the dangers the parasites present to the host, they have means of transferring to a new host, or at least having offspring that can do so. Let us pause for a moment to make an important distinction between the predator and the parasite. The predator kills a member of a species and devours them. Predators are normally few in number compared to that of their prey, so that the kills they make have little or no impact on the species overall. There are far fewer lions, for instance, than there are wildebeests. The parasite, on the other hand, does not seek the death of its prey, or rather its host. If the host does die, this is a kind of what we might call collateral damage from the parasite's point of view. Viruses are a type of parasite, and they, as all parasites, cannot exist without the host. To take the example of the influenza virus, it may kill its host, but this is rare, and mostly concerns those who are weak or in some way through old age or depressed immune system. Mostly it just moves from one living host to another. The host reacts to the parasite by altering the way it functions to make it inhospitable to the parasite, for instance, by raising its bodily temperature. This defense comes at the cost of making the host feel temporarily ill, but that is a necessary price worth paying. We do have predators in human society as well as parasites, but whereas the predators in nature operate under the laws of nature, human predators operate according to human law. If we are going to have a free enterprise system, as we must, we have to accept that predatorial behavior is going to be part of that. We have laws to prevent predative exploitation of the vulnerable, and so the principle of constraining predative behavior is established. But the free market tends to be the law of the jungle, at least according to the neoliberal ideology under which we live. I would argue that the way we govern this predative behavior should change, but an essay on parasites is not the place to pursue this. Many illnesses that humans suffer from are caused by parasites in the form of bacteria or viruses. If we wish to confront and maybe eradicate these, we need to understand how they work. So it is with human wealth-extracting parasites within our society. We need to understand how they work so that we can make their activities illegal. The great problem we have today is that in general, the biggest parasites we suffer from engage only in legal activities. Under present law, they commit no crime. The common thief is a parasite, but their activities are already illegal. We can never eliminate theft any more than we can eliminate influenza, but we do have in place a criminal justice system that recognizes the damage caused by theft, and this limits this wealth extraction to a greater or lesser extent. Our subject here is legal wealth extraction. Its practitioners represent some of the most powerful people in the country, and indeed on the planet. Some are household names. Some enjoy a highly protected, low profile. A major point of difference between human parasites and natural ones is that the former are able to, quite legally, extend and amplify their activities so that they accumulate vast fortunes and power. Here, let us remind ourselves of a fundamental point. You cannot amass a multi-billion-dollar fortune by normal, respectable, morally legitimate entrepreneurial activities. Such wealth can only result from some kind of skullduggery. In the case of the Russian multi-billionaire oligarchs, this was straightforward theft of state assets by insiders. But in the West, the methods of the parasites are more devious, and for most of us, less conspicuous in their operations. Bill Gates, for instance, grew his company Microsoft to become a virtual monopoly through a vicious campaign of eliminating the competition, and came close to facing the criminal justice system. He did not turn bad when he became mega wealthy. He was always bad. We experience the presence of the parasites through their effect on the economy and society, as wealth is drained out of it and vanishes into thin air, even if we are not aware of exactly what is happening. What we do know for sure is that we, in the West at least, live in rich societies. But these rich societies, where the vast majority of people become poorer and poorer and work harder and harder just to stay afloat, this is directly the result of the parasites. Another difference between human parasites and their counterparts in nature is that the former often kill the host. There are numerous examples of this happening in history, and this story is well told in Douglas Carswell's book, Progressives and Parasites, one of the few books to directly deal with this subject. He explains how the Roman Empire declined and fell not due to external invasions by hordes of Goths, Vandals and others, as orthodox history tells us, but because parasitic activity operating within the Roman economy destroyed it. The invaders found a formerly great civilization weakened and impoverished by domestic parasites. They destroyed the Roman world, at least in the West, and did put some kind of order in its place, but Rome was gone. Carswell also describes the downfall of another great republic, the Venetian Republic. This was also destroyed from within by parasitism, and by the time Napoleon arrived to finish it off, it was weakened beyond help. So this raises the big question as to whether the present-day parasites that work tirelessly within our society will destroy it. Will they kill their host? Or will they just weaken it so much that it can be taken over by outsiders, as the Western Roman Empire was? If this were to happen, the obvious candidate for taking us over would be China, and there is ample evidence that this is the Chinese plan. This possible scenario reminds us that the parasites are always traitors to the nation and will naturally side with aliens. But that is a major subject, and I discussed it elsewhere. Here, I want to concentrate on the main precise methods that our parasites use to extract wealth and establish their power within society and the economy. These methods are all economic. That is a key fact that characterizes human parasites. They are all about money. They have no sense of the finer aspects of life: art, ethics, kindness, democracy, civilization, culture, national pride, spirituality, and so on. They have found that money power can override every other sort of power and every other kind of value. They may appreciate luxury, but only of a vulgar, debauched, and even for satanic form. Their control over us is entirely due to their extreme wealth and nothing else. They have no virtue, upstandingness, or mandate that could justify their power. Bribery and corruption are their chief methods of control, and you cannot bribe people with virtue. This is how they pervert democracy and make it look like a joke. So the parasites, for all their trappings of wealth and prestige, are a rather boorish lot. Their view of the world is simplistic. If it does take on a more colourful dimension, it is in their religion of Luciferianism, and this I cover elsewhere. Here, and in the following videos, we are going to look at some of the chief ways in which they practice their wealth extraction, and thereby we will have the tools to dismantle them. I will start with the simplest and probably the oldest method used by parasites in the modern age. We are not concerned here with the type of operation of parasites already referred to in Venice or Rome, as those were specific to those cultures, although there may be parallels. I refer here to the export of capital. When people think about globalization, they normally focus on the export-import of goods and services. But global capital movements are decidedly more important, and these are just as globalized today as goods and services, if not more. After all, you can transfer capital with the press of a computer key, whereas goods require real-time shipping and even services require extensive setting up. The globalization of goods and services carries with it its own negative effects, and when unrestrained, it is decidedly undesirable, and when practiced by multinationals, frequently parasitic. I will discuss this later, but here I am concerned specifically with export-import of capital. This subject takes us straight away into the strong connection between parasitism and globalism. Parasites work against the interests of the nation in which they operate, and so naturally side with foreign or international interests. This is why to defeat the globalists, we have to start at home with our own domestic parasites and their agents. In Britain, most of them are British nationals. They are traitors to the nation, and many are public figures. This is why the anti-globalist movement must begin within nations and must be a series of national initiatives culminating in a revolution and a new constitution. And this is why this approach will succeed. We can undermine their source of money and therefore take their power away from them. The whole noise, rhetoric and sheer evil of the globalists would collapse as their parasitic activities are expelled from each nation. There is a long history of wealth extraction from Britain, and this goes back at least to James II, a Stuart king who was expelled by the Whig Party and replaced by William of Orange as part of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The history books tell us how James tried to take too much power onto himself, and how he constantly flirted with Catholicism and Louis XIV, the Catholic king of France, from whom he even accepted money. These were good enough reasons for the Whigs to want shot of him, but there is another crucially important reason that is less familiar. James had a scheme to export British capital to Russia and elsewhere and profit from these investments. But this capital was needed at home to support developments in agriculture and commerce here. The export of capital is always a form of parasitism, for that capital was created at home by British work and ingenuity, all supported by the state apparatus, education, services and infrastructure. Yes, those things did exist in James's day, perhaps more than we imagine. Britain should benefit as a whole from its economic activity. Some clearly will naturally benefit more than others, but with James's scheme, he and his cronies alone would have benefited from a British resource, classic parasitism. The Whigs have faded out of most people's awareness of our history, and so their vital role in forming the nation is not appreciated. This is a pity, but it is no doubt deliberate, as they were wholly committed to the nation, and this is an attitude that our current Tory leaders wish to suppress. Not all members of the Whig Party were landed aristocrats, as is often supposed, but many of the chief ones were. Now, if your wealth and power is derived from the land, you are naturally loyal to the land. That means loyalty to the country and the nation. Unlike money capital, you cannot export the land. The idea of exporting British capital was completely alien to them, and so that was an additional reason why they could not suffer any more of King James II. James II was backing the Tory party cause, which was to allow capital flight and develop a parasitic base against the pro-nation Whigs. And incidentally, this piece of history is important to the understanding of what the Tory party is about today, because of the toxicity of the Tory name in the late 18th century. They rebranded themselves as the Conservative Party, but they are still Tories, and I never use any other word to describe them. They are all about extracting wealth by free movement of capital, and now support a whole host of new parasitic activities added to this arsenal. These I will examine in turn as we go on. To repeat, we must understand these activities so that we can eliminate them. You cannot treat a virus unless you understand how it works. The Tories are deeply in bed with the City of London, which today is a corrupt nest of parasites and thieves. It does perform some activities that are useful, but this is a small part of its activity as a whole. To allow this understanding of parasitism, we must first remind ourselves of how a healthy, free, enterprise capitalist economy is supposed to work. You can probably even find this in some orthodox textbooks, but the pure theory they describe will conveniently ignore the existence of parasites and their anti-nation globalizing methods. It works like this. We have in the first place a person who has some capital at their disposal. They decide to create a business. For convenience, let us say it's a manufacturing business. They buy in property and plant, employ workers, and produce goods for sale. The sales go well, yielding more income than expenditure, and so there is a profit. The business person is left holding the value of the original capital plus the profit. There are now various options open to them in using the profit money available. 1. They can reinvest it in the business to expand production. 2. They can spend it on themselves with, say, a new house or boat. 3. They can place it in a bank and just leave it there. There are others, but these are the main ones. But crucially, let us assume that all these transactions are made within the nation. The point is that all these ways of spending the profit money benefit directly or indirectly the home economy, as long as they occur within the nation. Clearly, the first means more productive capacity for the nation. The second means more business for other companies or individuals, and this leads to more employment and other benefits. Even the third option still contributes to the national economy, for it means the bank is better capitalized and so can lend more to other national entrepreneurs. Also, the owner will receive interest on the bank deposits, which will be taxed, and more tax revenues benefit the nation as a whole. However you look at it, the country benefits. This is because the national treasure, as it used to be called, has been increased, and as a result, economic activity bringing more wages and profit increases. This is a virtuous circle, and it is the way countries and their peoples become prosperous. Now let us suppose this virtuous circle is broken. How is this achieved? It's simple. Instead of using the profit for any of the three above described, the owner of the business decides to export it. How and for what purpose this is done is not so important. The point is that the capital has been extracted from the economy that produced it. That money could only have been made because the nation maintains a legal system, an education system, reasonable infrastructure, and a state to oversee and regulate as necessary. The one who exports capital from a nation is benefiting from all these things, but is giving nothing back. This is why the Whigs so hated the plans of James II to export British capital to foreign countries. That is why the anti-globalist party, through the new constitution, will limit the possibility to export capital drastically, and then only for certain approved purposes. This capital, created in Britain, is part of the British national treasure. It is privately owned, of course, and that is good and well, but as long as it remains in the country, the nation benefits to a greater or lesser degree. But you might say, is that not how the capitalist system that we live under works? Surely we can do nothing about it. Has it not always been like that? The answers to these questions are all the same. No, no, and no. Let us start with the last of these questions. Hasn't there always been free movement of capital? As regards Britain, the freedom to export capital has been in place with or without various conditions since the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. This coincided with the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which regarded economic activity as happening in the whole world, or a universal republic, to use the words of German political economist Friedrich List, criticizing Smith. This was the revolution in economic thinking that Smith created. Until that time, there was no such subject as economics. There was only the subject of political economy. This was because no one had thought to disengage economic activity from political activity. To do so would be to create a phony economic science that would claim to operate like real science, such as that of Isaac Newton. But Smith's pseudoscience was amenable to the political agenda of certain powerful elements in society, as it still is. One of the chief reasons for creating the British Empire was to allow capital to be exported to foreign lands and invested there where labour was cheap. This left the home economy starved of capital and led directly to the appalling conditions under which people worked. The mill owner is presented as the villain who paid a pittance to their workers to turn a profit, but this is due in great measure to the fact that the business suffered a lack of capital. Britain notoriously allowed child labour as a matter of course well into the 19th century, and this can only be put down to the same lack of capital to enable industry to develop in a civilised way. The City of London was a major participant in the directing of capital to overseas sweatshops in the colonies and still serves this function even if the countries concerned are no longer colonies. It is worth noting here that Britain invented the colonial empire. Until then, empires grew by annexing neighbouring lands and nations. The Persian, Roman, Russian, Ottoman and Austrian empires, for instance, had all grown in this way. Now, the vitally important difference between those empires and colonial empires is in the word annex. This means that the people of the annexed lands had the same or similar status to those of the empire's centre. They may have been forcibly annexed, but their situation following annexation was similar to others within the whole of the empire, including the state that originated the empire. They may well even have been better off. A colonial empire is entirely different. The people of the colony have completely different rights to those of the home state. They may have no rights at all, being in effect slaves. Empires are built by annexation for a variety of reasons: cultural, commercial, or defensive. Colonial empires exist for one reason: exploitation. This was how the British Empire was run, and an attitude of superiority and racism was cultivated under it that would have been alien to, say, the Persian or Austrian empires. The point of this slight diversion in the discussion of empires is to bring out the point that export of capital from Britain has been a long tradition, but is also important to our wider theme because the British Empire became the initial basis for the present New World Order. That story is vital to understanding the globalists of today, and I describe that elsewhere. Certainly, the shameful decline of British industry in the 20th century, which continues today, is due to the lack of capital. When profits are made by industry, the City of London is on hand to find a way for the owner to make easy money by shipping the capital abroad. Why go to all the trouble of building a home industry with all the risks involved? Of course, there are exceptions, and there are many excellent home-based British companies, and most of these are SMEs, that is, small and medium-sized enterprises, and these we applaud. Take a familiar recent example of a large company extracting some domestic wealth. Dyson decided to take most of his production abroad to Singapore, so depriving the country that had enabled his success the benefits of his capital. Now we should take a step back and remind ourselves that he did this partly because of the business environment he works under, both at home and internationally. This business environment is created by the government. Compare this with the German company BMW. Can you imagine BMW taking the manufacture of their cars overseas? If the idea was even broached, you could be sure that the German government would step in with strong persuaders to prevent this from happening. Germany, as I explain elsewhere, is still highly influenced by the economic theory of Friedrich List, which emphasizes home production, whereas Britain still labours under the theories of Adam Smith, which sees the economy as extending internationally across borders. The national economic unit is secondary importance in economic policy, if it is recognised at all. It is easy to see how Smith's economics was amenable to the makers of the British Empire, and List's was not at all. Let us return to the question we posed earlier of whether or not Britain has always existed with free movement of capital allowed throughout the world. As I said, the answer is no, for under the Bretton Woods Agreement signed by participant countries in 1944, the free movement of capital was highly restricted. This meant that countries operated under the system I described above, where profits were recycled within each nation, creating a virtuous circle of prosperity and innovation. It is true that nations also benefit from the Marshall Plan, whereby the US helped to finance this, but that money would have been wasted if the capital exchange controls had not been in place. I hear time over time again people saying that the post-war period of prosperity and economic expansion was finished when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971. This is rank nonsense on many levels. Anyone who thinks backing a currency with gold is desirable and represents any kind of solution to our severe economic problems understands neither economic history nor economic theory. Just for the record, the only way to run a currency is as a national fiat currency, whereby it is backed by two factors. One, the strength of economic activity of the nation using the currency, and two, the ability of that nation's government to raise taxes from that economy. For instance, the reason why the Russian ruble is always weak is one, because the economy as a whole is not strong, producing few exports, and two, there is a lot of leakage between the taxes paid by people and businesses and the taxes received by the government. Some estimates are as high as 33%. To return to our central theme of capital controls, we should remind ourselves that the Bretton Woods Agreement that so successfully created a period of economic prosperity and advancement had two main aspects to it. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules for commercial and financial arrangements amongst the United States, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan. The Bretton Woods system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to cover monetary relations amongst independent states. The chief features of the Bretton Woods systems were two: to peg the dollar to the gold standard and then peg the currencies of participating nations to the dollar. 2. Restrict drastically capital movements between countries. With these went an obligation for each country to adopt a monetary policy that maintained its external exchange rates within 1%. The International Monetary Fund was there to bridge temporary imbalances of payments. Also, there was a need to address the lack of cooperation amongst countries and to prevent competitive devaluations of the currencies. Bretton Woods did not create the IMF with all its aggressive lending to third world countries, as is often alleged. The IMF was simply there to regulate and manage the all-important system of capital controls. Those who are old enough to have lived through this system will remember Prime Minister Harold Wilson's desperate apology to the nation in 1967 when he was forced to depart from the Bretton Woods Agreement to a small degree by devaluing the pound. They may also remember that exchange controls were so forcefully implemented that at one point British people holidaying abroad had their spending money limited to £50. This last measure strictly concerns import-exports, not capital movement, but it shows the quite different attitude to foreign money movements at that time compared to today. This resulted in a golden age of capitalism during the post-war years. War-torn countries like Britain, France, and Germany were able to rebuild their economies like never before. In the economic chaos of the years immediately following World War II, the gold standard was probably necessary. But by the time Nixon took dollar off the gold standard in 1971, it had outlived its usefulness. I discussed the question of money supply and currencies elsewhere and explain why linking currencies to the value of gold is a disaster, both in theory and in practice. What was of central importance to developments around 1971 was the demise of the system of capital movement controls. Once capital could freely escape the country that created it, the parasites could set to work, and this is what they have been doing ever since. Margaret Thatcher, shortly after being elected, removed all of Britain's capital exchange controls in 1979, so definitively destroying Bretton Woods. But the system had already been undermined 10 years earlier, and for this we have to thank our friends in the city, who are always seeking ways to facilitate parasitic scams and extract wealth from the economy. During the Bretton Woods era, real working economies prospered, but finance went into decline. The agreement effectively closed off many of the tricks that the City of London liked to get up to. The square mile was drab and very quiet. Nobody was making vast fortunes. But some very clever people in the city had noticed a weakness in the Bretton Woods exchange control system. This was the fact that there were already millions of dollars in banks outside the USA. The British government, as a signature to Bretton Woods, could have managed this and maintained a system of controls. But when has any British government not been in bed with the city? The operatives in the city dreamed up a system known as Eurodollars, whereby dollars could be traded and speculated on. This was to undermine the system of exchange controls, as the dollar was no longer solely subject to events in the real economy of the United States, as sound economics would demand. Fluctuations in the value of the dollar due to speculation undermined the whole system. The golden era came to an end. Currencies were then floated against each other so that they were no longer tied to the dollar at a fixed rate. They became fiat currency, and so their value depended on the factors I have described above: economic strength of the nation and the ability of the nation to raise taxes on the economy. Floating currencies are not the problem. Indeed, as a believer in fiat currencies as the only viable solution, I also believe in the value of currencies floating against each other. The two go together. This is part of my belief in sovereign nations and sovereign economics, where there is no external central authority determining the value of currencies. Of course, a globalist creation like the EU believes in abolishing the currencies of individual countries altogether. The people behind the WEF seek to establish one single worldwide currency. Belief in fiat currencies under a system of floating exchange rates is all part of belief in sovereign, independent nationhood. Perhaps I should interpose in this, if it is not completely obvious, that fiat currencies only work in a properly run system of money creation. The current use of quantitative easing, for example, is a violation of all sound economic management practice and is an abomination. This I discuss elsewhere, where I deal with the subject of money in detail. Although the Bretton Woods system was the result of an international agreement, we do not need now an international agreement to establish capital controls and put in place the virtuous circle within our nation whereby profits are fed back into the economy. We are against any such overarching internationalism as a solution to the problems we face now. The whole driver behind our anti-globalist stance is that we do things alone, as any external international body can be captured by the globalists. Other countries can do what they want. This success of sovereign economics does not depend on them. However, it is very desirable that other countries follow us on the road to independence and prosperity, so that on the one hand we undermine the effects of the globalists, and on the other pursue our goal of a great revival of civilization linked by a shared humanity. Having made the case for control of export of domestic capital, we might ask the question, what about capital coming into the country? What about foreign individuals or companies investing in Britain or simply placing money in British assets, such as property? Does not the imported capital cancel out the exported capital? No, it does not. It is a common and very grave mistake to set off one against the other, as orthodox economists are apt to do. They do this because they see economics in terms of mathematics, not, as List would do, in terms of the effect of the working economy. We have seen how damaging the export of capital is, as it breaks the virtuous circle whereby profits are recirculated into the domestic economy for the benefit of all. Consider now import of capital. Take the simple example of purchase of London property by foreigners, as happens now in great measure. This is wholly malign, as it distorts the domestic market for property, so breaking the economic link between domestic earnings and property prices. The result is an absurd uplift in property values, making it difficult or impossible for domestic earners to afford to buy a house or a flat to live in. But let us now consider what happens when a foreign company does not just acquire British assets, but actually uses its own money to build plant and create manufacturing anew. The example of Nissan's great car-producing factory in Newcastle is held up as a magnificent example of how we can benefit from an initiative by a major foreign company, creating jobs directly and indirectly. The cry goes up from the Tories, let's have more investment like that of Nissan. Grants and subsidies, bribes, are put in place to encourage more like this. But let us state the very obvious fact. The plant may be in Britain, but all the profits from it will flow back to the home country of Nissan. We won't see a penny of its profits. So the virtuous circle whereby profits flow back to the domestic economy does not exist. Also, Nissan can decide at will to withdraw its production from Britain and remove all of its plant or sell it off, or it can simply downsize to suit its global operations. And a very major effect it has is to discourage British entrepreneurs from setting up domestically owned car production, as they will face the might of Nissan as a competitor. If you compare the effect of this foreign-owned company on British soil with the effect of a similar one owned by Britain, the result is wholly negative. It is just as destructive of the working of the domestic economy as the rich billionaires who distort the London property market. So when we count up the amount of capital exported from Britain and subtract it from the amount imported to give us a more benign impression of capital movements, we are completely distorting the picture. The important figure that really means something for the economy is the exported capital plus the imported capital. We have no need of either. Both are detrimental. But to finish the remarks on the example of Nissan, we should ask how it is that we needed Nissan to come in and create car production when in the past we had our own large car production capacity that in the 1960s, under Bretton Woods, supplied virtually the whole of the home market. It is not because British manufacturers are hopeless in comparison with foreign ones. It is not that we don't have the technological know-how, the training, the talent, the capacity for innovation, the design flair, or the management skills. Of course, we have all these things, and we have them in greater measure than many other countries. In certain areas, we are supreme. So why does it take Nissan to make cars in Britain? The answer is not that Nissan is important, all the factors I just listed, because we don't have them. Nissan imports just one thing that we don't have: good backing by banks. With Nissan, we did not import foreign car manufacturing, we imported foreign banking. So it is with most inward investment. The government pleads and begs foreign companies to set up in Britain with all kinds of incentives, often amounting to straightforward bribes, paid for by the taxpayer. What it should do is to stop the export of British capital so that its owners will have no choice but to invest it in the country that enabled them to accumulate that capital. Instead of subsidising foreign countries to set up in Britain, it should be subsidising British companies to set up in Britain. The City of London would jump up and down, and orthodox economists would be waving around the neoliberal textbooks as if they were Bibles. But no one is being robbed. In fact, the new breed of British investors in Britain might well start to take a pride in their country and their part in its future. And let us not forget, a prosperous, well-invested Britain would be a happier place, and our British investors and their families would no longer need to skulk overseas, but could participate in that. This simple measure of capital controls would further love of nation and love of its people. Other nations would follow to create a vibrant community and a new golden age. We cannot leave the subject of the export of capital without mentioning the dirty little secret associated with much of this business that flows through the City of London. Well, it is not exactly so secret, but many details of how it works are. This concerns the British tax havens. We are encouraged to think of the City of London as the so-called square mile, a section of London that enjoys some administrative independence compared with the rest of the country and is a major centre for finance in Britain. In reality, the city is one of an archipelago of islands that circle the North Atlantic, including some of the Caribbean, that all exist almost exclusively by virtue of the peculiarities of their banking laws. These are the British tax havens, all our crown possessions, that is to say, the Queen is their head of state. She runs them through a governor that she has in each one of them, and her position is far from ceremonial. She has the right to veto all legislation passed through the local island parliaments. Here it is the laws on banking secrecy that are the most crucial in achieving the status of a tax haven. The Queen complies with this arrangement, and this is just one reason that confirms that the House of Windsor is totally implicated with the globalists. Let us be clear, the reputation of the city as a financial centre rests in great measure on its links to the tax havens, without which much of its skullduggery would not be possible. All the tax havens have laws that make it an offence carrying severe penalties for an employer of a bank to disclose any transactions that take place within the bank, even when they involve plainly illicit activities. This also means that these island banks can shelter the deposits from the eyes of the tax authorities. This is tax evasion on a grand scale. The tax havens add an extra bitter sting to the export of domestic capital from Britain, for they provide a direct deprivation of the British Exchequer of revenue that is due to it. This is theft from the British people, legitimised and facilitated by the city and the monarch. Parasite-backed politicians love to point to the tax that the city banks and dealers pay to the British Exchequer, but what they never mention is the tax evasion and avoidance that the city enables, so robbing the Exchequer. The banking secrecy laws means that the tax havens attract the proceeds of drug barons, child traffickers, arms runners, international terrorists, money stolen by corrupt national leaders, and money stolen by corrupt national officials from all over the world, and every conceivable type of villain with ill-gotten gains to hide. The tax havens also enable multinational companies to mitigate tax, and this means they keep their retail prices down, so undermining national companies operating fairly. Multinationals demand special consideration by the AGP. The so-called superiority of multinational production depends on this manipulation as much as economies of scale. No nation that stands for ethics and morality and that wants to see its children brought up knowing the difference between right and wrong could tolerate the City of London and its associated island tax havens. The head of the House of Windsor, with the help of the City of London, signs all this through. In her Christmas message to the British people, the Queen always mentions the countries of the Commonwealth, of which she is head, but never mentions the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, the Virgin Islands, or Gibraltar, or any of the other shady tax havens of which she is also head. I wonder why. Nor, to my knowledge, does she ever visit them. However, she does make full use of them to hide some of her vast fortune away from the prying eyes of the Inland Revenue. In this essay, I have dealt with the principles of parasitic wealth extraction and described the oldest method used, export of capital. However, since World War II, the parasites have developed many more elaborate ways to extract wealth and disadvantage and deprive good, legitimate economic activity. These I will deal with in subsequent videos. The importance of understanding these parasitic activities cannot be underestimated if we are to defeat the globalists, for they depend on them for their one source of power, obscene, unimaginable wealth. Up until 1990, these activities were mainly focused around artificial inflation of asset prices and securitization. Since 1990, there has been an explosion in the techniques of wealth extraction, and the market for derivatives of one kind or another forms a big part of this. All these techniques come down to one thing: the creation of new asset classes. It is the top heaviness of the economy, with the astronomical increase in asset value, that delivers wealth and power to the globalist parasites and impoverishes the rest of us. And the globalist climate change movement has itself created new asset classes for speculation and magnification of asset values. The creation of carbon trading is one such, and at the recent COP26 meeting in Glasgow, they even hatched a new scheme for transforming natural resources into a new asset class. Anyone who thinks these tools are about climate and not about parasitic economics is living in a land of make-believe. All this concentration on increasing the value of existing asset classes and inventing new ones to add to the pile is parasitism at work. None of it benefits the real economy and the wage earners and entrepreneurs that work within it. The globalists have always used their proceeds from parasitism to magnify their power and attack civilization. Now, as parasitic economic wealth extracting activities dominate the economies of the world, they are in a position to launch their final bid for world power and world government. As parasites, they are not part of normal human society, and they do not partake of its morality or its mores. Parasites, whether in nature or in human society, are always 100% detrimental to the host. They are by nature Luciferian, by which I mean they turn morality on its head. Evil becomes good, good becomes evil. They are not part of us. They see themselves as a separate elite, above morality, above humanity. They proceed to their goals using every kind of godless, amoral, ruthless, lying, murderous evil imaginable.